What is up, guys? Welcome back to Wrench Avengers. Today, we're going to be talking about and working on the rod bearing and main bearing clearances. So if you've seen my last video, you'll know that my last engine spun a rod bearing really badly. And that mixed with a handful of other things, decided I was going to get just a fresh block, had one laying around, took it to the machine shop, got it honed to proper piston to wall clearance, and got it decked for flatness and basically made it fresh, ready to go for this new engine build. Along with that, I also got a new crank that I got balanced and micro polished. And we might talk about balancing and micro polishing in a later video. So I'm going to spec out the rod and main bearing clearances, and instead of using the classic plastic gauge method, I'm going to use micrometers and a dial bore gauge to get a little more precise. The reason I'm going with these tools instead of regular plastic gauge is I'm looking for a little bit more precision to get a more specific bearing clearance than what Honda would normally recommend from the factory. And let's dive into that a little bit. So kind of an old school method of determining your bearing clearance is by taking about 1/1000th of an inch for every inch of journal size. So if you got a 2-inch journal, you'd have 2/1000ths of an inch for bearing clearance. Probably give or take 5/10,000ths of an inch. And that's a rule of thumb that's still used today. But let's compare this rule of thumb to what Honda recommends in the manual for D16Z6. D16's main journal should be somewhere around, and because I don't know how to say it, is 2.1644 of an inch to 2.1654. My brain can't figure out how to say that correctly. And then for the rod journals, the journal should be about 1.7707 to 1.7717. So using this rule of thumb, we'd probably want to be somewhere in the 2/1000ths to 25/10,000ths on the mains, and then probably 17/10,000ths to 2/1000ths on the rods. These are fairly rough numbers. But looking in the Honda manual, they want 7/10,000ths to 14/10,000ths for 1 and 5 on the main journals. Then 1/1000th to 17/10,000ths on 2, 3, and 4. Then on the rods, 8/10,000ths to 15/10,000ths. So it's a little bit tighter than the rule of thumb, so why would Honda want to go that tight with it? And why would we want to go that loose with it? So back in the day, they had a saying of loose is fast. We kind of know that's not really true. The tighter the bearing clearance, the thinner oil you can run. And the thinner oil you can run, the more power you can make. With tighter clearances, you'll have less rotating mass, as there won't be as much oil spilling out the sides of the rod bearings, causing that mass to be slung around on the crankshaft. That's something we'll talk about a little more in a later video. So when Honda designed the engine with those bearing clearances, they had an actual oil viscosity in mind, along with a horsepower number and a max RPM that engine was going to spin. So these tighter tolerances would kind of make sense. But whenever you add a turbo and you double or triple or maybe quadruple the amount of horsepower originally designed in that engine, and then also maybe spin it to 3,000 RPM higher, those tighter bearing clearances stop really making sense. So what we do is we go ahead and loosen up those clearances, give a little bit more cushion between the bearing clearance, or between the bearing face and the crank journal. You can see in the image there's a trade-off. With a low or a tighter clearance, the oil film is distributed more evenly across the crank journal, allowing more oil to contact, for lack of a better term, makes it a bit more slippy. Can't believe anybody'd ever watch this shit. But what it also does is leaves less room for the journal to be able to move inside that bearing without coming in contact with it. As well as, if the crank surface isn't completely perfectly smooth, then you'll have more concern of contacting that bearing. On the high or loose clearance, we see the oil film is narrower and contacting less of the journal. But what it does do is allow more room between the journal and the bearing. So if, say, the engine detonated and forced the rod down on the crank, there'll be more cushion for the push-in, and the journal shouldn't hit the bearing. Now the image is obviously a little bit exaggerated, as we're just dealing with thousandths of an inch, but in an engine that can make a difference. So when we bump the power up to 300 or 400 horsepower on an engine originally designed to make 100, and then we rev it out to 9,000 RPM when it was originally designed to rev to 7,000, we have to start making changes inside that rotating assembly to handle those forces that Honda didn't originally account for. But when we loosen up those clearances, we will likely need to run a higher viscosity oil, a thicker oil, in order to take up that space between the crank and the bearing and keep our oil pressure up, because otherwise it's going to drop if you use your regular conventional shitty oil you're running in your daily driver. You also want to use a higher quality oil, not something that's going to break down quickly over time, again, like the stuff you use in your daily driver, and probably want to change it often as well. Take it from a guy who didn't do these things, and, But know when you go to these looser bearing clearances, you are going to be sacrificing a little bit of horsepower, but probably adding a little bit of extra safety into the engine. And we'll talk about adding that horsepower back a little bit in another video. Now that we've discussed all that, let's get into what my bearing clearances actually ended up being and the process that I did to check that. I used King Racing XP bearings, both in standard and standard X size, so that I could mix and match to get the proper bearing clearances on the mains and the rods. Okay. I think that's good. I just don't know. Okay. I'm gonna guess that's good. So then we're gonna take it and chuck it in a vise here. Okay, so we got it in the vise here. Now we need to get your dial bore gauge set up. Alright, let me hit you back once I got it set up. Okay, hopefully you can hear me over the DA. So I've got this up in the vise, and I've got my dial bore gauge set. Basically, I'll put it into the... So, as we've seen earlier, I set this to the size of the first main journal on the crankshaft. So this should be the same size as the main journal. And then we will basically set this in here and work to zero it out. And I had it zeroed. Yeah, like zero. Maybe. But I'll see if I can't get you to see that too. I don't know if you guys will be able to see this or not. It's pretty bad, but it's kind of hard to do this. So it's zero right where that needle turns the other direction. You can see as I keep going up, switches over,
That's where it's 0. So then we will take it over to the block. Okay, so we had the mic set and we'd zeroed out our bore gauge. And now we're going to take the bore gauge and we're going to stick it in the bore. And that should tell us the difference. This isn't zeroed right now because it's not in there. But this should tell us the difference. We just need to make sure we stay in a decent spot. So this should tell us wherever that turns. There we go. Oh, shit. It's kind of tedious. Oop. Okay, so I'm going to try to show you guys if I can. So where that needle switches back is where we'll mark it from. Which looks like it's right on the 5, on the 5th mark. So if it measured in 5 10,000ths, then 5 times 5 10,000ths should be 25 10,000ths, which is much looser than the Honda spec, but I'm actually looking for loose. I may put on a half shell of a standard, which should bring it down to 2,000ths instead of 25. But I haven't 100% decided on that. I'm going to measure out the rest of these in the exact same way. Just measure the crank with the micrometers, and then zero out the bore gauge, and then measure it up in there. So I'm going to try that, get them all measured out, and then after they're measured, we'll go from there. Okay, so I've got all of the main bearings measured. Let's see. So number 1 was 2,000ths, 25 10,000ths, 25 10,000ths, 25 10,000ths, and then 17 10,000ths. As you know, that's a little bit on the looser side than what the Honda spec is, but I'll go into that a little bit more later. Now we're going to get to measuring the rod bearings, and I had to obtain a 1 to 2 inch outside mic because the ones I was borrowing from my coworker did not have a 1 to 2 inch. So let's get to it. Okay, so I got this matched up to my number 1. That's what we're going to start with, number 1. Got my dial bore gauge. We're basically going to do the same thing we did with the mains, just on the rods. Seems to be good. Okay, now we're set. Just push it out of the way. Got my rod here. Now let's check this guy. That's better, I think. It's a little bit on the loose side. So we're looking at about 25 10,000ths to sort of like 30-ish, 3,000ths. 25 10,000ths. I think I'll split that half with a, these are the loose standard X's, if you can read. I'll take half off and put the standards on, 1/2. See where that puts me. I'm looking for 17 10,000ths to 22 10,000ths. Okay, maybe this will be the last one. I don't know. I've got both standards on it this time. Stick them on in there and see where we're at. 1 2 3 4. It's 20. That's better. Oop, oop, oop. Yeah, it's about 20 or 2,000ths. So, about right where I want it. And after doing that 500 times, I'm going to do it 500 more times with all the others. So I got 2, 3, and 4 to go. I'll get them done, and then we'll go from there.
With the rods, my clearances ended up being 2,000ths, 17 10,000ths, 18 10,000ths, and then 2,000ths. That puts my rods a little bit tighter than I'd like to see. I would have been happier if all of them were at 2,000ths, but they're still on the high side of the Honda spec, if nothing else, and I think they'll probably work out, but I guess we'll see. Now, this video may seem a little bit simple for some of you guys, but others, kind of like me, just may never even really put any thought to the bearing clearances. Not that I always aimed for Honda clearances, but I'd try to go for the loose side, but started really looking into what the clearance ought to be and why. And so, don't really think about those kinds of things until you kill every engine with the spun bearing. But I appreciate you guys sticking it out. I know the video is a little bit on the long side. Go ahead and give this video a dislike if you thought it was super long and boring, but give it a like if you like to nerd out on, just engine concepts and why you do things. I don't know. Like it if you liked it. Leave a comment down below if you think that these clearances are going to work out okay for me. I expect to run at least 300. That's what the engine previously made, and we'll probably step it up from there. So maybe in the 400 horsepower range. So let me know if you think these clearances are going to work out. Stick around for more videos like this. I've got more on this build coming. Probably one more on rotating assembly, but it will be likely shorter and not so much numbers. And then consider subscribing if you like what I'm doing. Check out my Instagram, and I'll catch you on the flippity flip.